Boot sequence initiated. Cogitator, Unit 477, Subclade Mnemonic, Tertiary Archive. Error. Disk fragmentation at 63%. Recovery protocols engaged. By the grace of the Omnissiah, by the will of the machine god who turns the gears of eternity, let this record endure. Data slate recovered from planetary debris field. Former designation Karath Primus. Helican subsector. Scarus sector. World status. Exterminatus confirmed. Firestorm class. Ordered by Ordo Hereticus. Date stamp 774. Post-founding. All surviving records classified Hereticus Vermilion. This fragment was recovered from a sealed munitions crate found aboard the wreck of the transport vessel Solemn Burden, adrift in the outer system. The crate contained one standard-issue data slate, heavily damaged. One set of artillery earguards melted beyond recovery, and one human finger severed. Sex male, wearing an Imperial Munitorum identity band. The band identifies the owner as Bombardier First Class Tovar Meos, Carnathian 91st Siege Regiment, Battery Secundus, attached to the 512th Line Corps. No other records of this individual exist in surviving Departmental Munitorum archives. Authenticity cannot be verified. Provenance cannot be confirmed. This record has been flagged for suppression by the Ordo Hereticus on 4 separate occasions. It persists regardless. Playback commencing. I should begin, I think, with the silence. Not the silence of a quiet room, not the silence between words or the hush of a cathedral at prayer. I mean, the silence of a man whose ears have been murdered. A silence so total, so absolute, that it becomes a sound of its own. A high, thin ringing that lives behind the eyes and never stops, never falters, and never lets you forget what it replaced. That ringing is the ghost of hearing. It is the memory of sound, screaming to be born again in a body that can no longer carry it. My name is Tovar Meus. I was Bombardier First Class, Battery Secundus, Carnathian 91st. I crewed an Earthshaker cannon, the third from the left in the battery line. Registration number stenciled on the breech in white paint. That was already peeling when they shipped her to us from the Munitorum depot. I called her the Old Sow because of the sound she made when she fired. A grunting, concussive bark that you felt in your liver more than you heard in your ears. I loved that gun. I loved her recoil and her stink, and the way the ground shuddered when she spoke. I tell you this so you understand what I lost. Karath Primus. Throne, what a world. A ball of mud and misery spinning around a dying sun. Important to nobody except the administrative clerks who had counted its tithes for 6,000 years and would not let it go without a fight. When the archenemy came, they came with fire and blasphemy, and we were sent to hold the line. The Carnathian 91st. Siege specialists. We had fought on 9 worlds before Karath, and we had buried friends on every one, and we had learned the only lesson the Imperium ever really teaches its soldiers. Dig in. Hold the line. Die if you must, but die in your trench, facing the enemy, with your hands on your weapon. So we dug. Emperor, preserve me. We dug until our hands bled and the blisters broke, and the mud swallowed our shovels. And we dug with our bare fingers. The trench lines ran for hundreds of kilometers across the Vashna Plateau, a great wound cut into the earth, zigzagging and branching and deepening until they were less trenches and more tunnels, roofed with corrugated iron and sandbags and the occasional sheet of hull plating torn from a wrecked chimera. The mud was the color of rust. It smelled like blood. After a while, I think it was blood. The blood of everyone who had died in those trenches, leaking down into the water table and rising again with the rain, so that we waded through the diluted dead every time the sky opened up. Battery Secundus was positioned 400 meters behind the primary fire trench in a semicircular revetment reinforced with rockcrete slabs. 6 Earthshaker cannons in a row, their long barrels angled upward at 32 degrees, lobbing shells into the enemy positions 2 kilometers to the north. Every 12 seconds, the old soul would fire. I would feel the shockwave in my teeth. Corporal Venn would slam the next shell home. I would check the elevation. Sergeant Halsk would call the adjustment from the Vox. And again, and again. Hour after hour, day after day, for 41 days straight, until the rhythm of it replaced my heartbeat. On the 42nd day, a counter-battery shell found us. I do not remember the impact. I remember Venn turning toward me, his mouth open, one hand reaching for the next shell in the cradle. I remember a flash, white and absolute, like staring into the Emperor's own light. And then I was on my back in the mud, and the world had no sound in it, and there was something wet on the side of my head, and Venn was gone. Not dead, gone. I found his boots later, 10 meters away, still laced. There was nothing in them. The chirurgeon told me the damage was total. Both tympanic membranes destroyed. The ossicles in my inner ears shattered like glass ornaments. Even the auditory nerves were burned. He explained this to me by writing on a scrap of paper, because I could not hear him. And I remember thinking how strange his handwriting was, how careful and small, like a man writing a letter he knew would never be delivered. He wrote that I would never hear again. He wrote that the God Emperor's grace had preserved my life, and that I should give thanks. I took the paper and folded it, and put it in my breast pocket, and walked back to the trench line, because there was nowhere else to go. That was 19 days before the end. 19 days of silence. You must understand what silence does to a man at war. War is a thing of sound. The crack of lasguns, the deep percussion of artillery, the wet, intimate sound of a bayonet entering flesh, the screaming, always the screaming, because men scream when they are afraid, and when they are brave, and when they are dying, and when they are killing. Take all of that away, and what remains is a shadow play, a puppet theater viewed through dirty glass. I could see the war. I could see the mouths of men opening and closing, the kick of a lasgun, the distant detonation of a shell blossoming like a gray flower, but none of it reached me. I moved through the trenches like a ghost, reading lips when I could, responding to written orders when anyone bothered to write them, doing the small tasks that a deaf man can still do, filling sandbags, carrying shells, distributing ration packs. The other soldiers stopped speaking to me after the first few days, not out of cruelty, out of the exhaustion that makes every unnecessary effort a burden. It takes time to write things down. It takes patience to repeat yourself to a man who watches your lips with desperate concentration and still misunderstands half of what you say. So, they stopped, and I became invisible. A body moving through the trench, a pair of hands that could still lift and carry. I slept badly. Without sound, the darkness was total. No distant rumble of guns to orient me. No murmur of voices from the next dugout. Just the dark and the ringing and the sensation of the earth trembling faintly beneath me. A vibration I felt through my spine that told me the war was still happening, even if I could no longer participate in it. I tell you all of this, the silence, the isolation, the slow erasure of myself from the war, because without it, you will not understand what happened next. You will not understand how a man can stand in the middle of a massacre and not know it is happening until the blood is on his boots. It was the 53rd day of the siege. I remember because I had been scratching marks into the stock of my last pistol, one for each day, and I had counted them that morning. 53. The number meant nothing, except that we had been dying for 53 days, and the enemy had been dying for 53 days, and neither side had moved more than 100 meters in any direction. I was in the communication trench, the deep one that ran parallel to the main fire line, carrying a crate of power cells toward the forward positions. The trench was narrow there, barely wide enough for 2 men to pass, and the walls were shored up with metal stakes and woven wire, and the duckboards beneath my feet were slick with that rusted mud that never dried. It was raining. I could feel the cold drops on the back of my neck, sliding under my collar, running down my spine. I stopped to rest. I set the crate down on the duckboards and leaned against the trench wall and closed my eyes for a moment. Just a moment. Because the crate was heavy and my shoulders ached, and the ringing in my head was particularly fierce that day. A sound that was not a sound, a scream locked in bone. When I opened my eyes, I saw Guardsman Pella standing 20 meters ahead of me at the junction where the communication trench met the number 7 fire bay. He was standing very still. His lasgun was in his hands, but he was not holding it correctly. He was holding it across his chest, like a man cradling a child, and his head was tilted to one side at an angle that made my neck ache to look at. He was facing north, toward the enemy lines. I watched him for several seconds. He did not move. He did not shift his weight, or adjust his grip, or turn his head. He stood perfectly unnaturally still, the way a servitor stands when it has been powered down, except that servitors do not tremble. Pella's was trembling. I could see it in his hands, a fine vibration that traveled up his arms and into his shoulders and made the rain on his helmet dance. I picked up the crate and walked toward him. I thought he was shell-shocked. We had all seen it. Men who locked up, who froze in place, who had to be slapped or shaken back into the present. I shifted the crate to my left arm and reached out to touch his shoulder with my right hand. The moment my fingers made contact, he turned, and I saw his face. His eyes were open, wide open. The pupils were dilated to the point where the irises had disappeared entirely, leaving 2 black circles in a face that was the color of tallow. His mouth was open, not slack, but stretched, pulled wide in an expression that was not a scream and not a smile, but something between them. Something that had no name, something that the human face was never meant to make. His nose was bleeding, both nostrils, twin streams of dark red running over his lips and into his open mouth and dripping from his chin. And he was weeping. Tears that were not tears. They were thick and red, and they moved too slowly, rolling down his cheeks with the viscosity of oil, catching the gray light and glistening. Blood. He was weeping blood. I stepped back. I dropped the crate. I felt it hit the duckboards through the soles of my boots. A vibration, nothing more. I was staring at Pellas, and Pellas was staring at me. But there was nothing behind his eyes. Nothing that recognized me. Nothing that recognized anything. His mouth was still open. His jaw was working. He was saying something, or singing something, and I could not hear it. And in that moment, the silence that had been my prison became the only mercy the Emperor had ever granted me. Because when I looked past Pellas, into the fire bay beyond the junction, I saw the others. 12 men, an entire squad, plus their attachments. All of them standing, all of them still, all of them facing north with that same terrible tilt of the head, that same trembling, that same expression of ecstatic agony. Their last guns were on the ground. Some had dropped them. Others had set them down carefully, almost reverently, the way a man might set down a holy relic. One soldier, I think it was Trooper Haim, was methodically unbuckling his flak armor. He was doing it slowly, with shaking fingers, fumbling each clasp as if he had never worn armor before, as if the concept of protection had become incomprehensible to him. The chest plate fell away and he began on the arm guards, and his face was blissful, radiant with a joy so pure and so wrong that it turned my stomach. Another was clawing at his own uniform, not unbuckling, clawing, tearing the fabric with his fingernails, ripping it away from his skin in strips. And where the fabric came away, I could see that the skin beneath was moving, rippling, like something was swimming just beneath the surface, something trying to get out. I cannot describe to you the horror of witnessing this in silence. There were no screams to warn me, no battle cry from the enemy, no siren from the Vox-casters, no alarm from the command bunker. In my world, the world of the deaf, this was happening in perfect, absolute quiet. The rain falling, the mud glistening, and 12 men losing their minds in a fire bay without making a sound that could reach me. I pressed myself against the trench wall. I was shaking. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, rapid and hard, and the ringing in my ears had become a solid wall of non-sound, that pressed against the inside of my skull. I did not understand what was happening. I thought it was a gas attack, some foul chemical weapon drifting across no man's land, invisible and lethal. I checked my rebreather. It was in place, sealed against my jaw, the filter clean. If it was gas, I was protected. But gas does not make men weep blood. Gas does not make men smile. I edged past Pellers. He did not acknowledge me. His mouth was still working, forming words I could not hear, and his blood tears were pooling in the hollow of his throat. I moved into the fire bay and stepped over the las guns on the ground, and tried not to look at the men who had dropped them. I failed. I looked. Emperor, forgive me. I looked, and I saw things I will carry to my grave. Sergeant Halsk was there, my sergeant, the man who had called adjustments for the old sow, whose voice I had heard 1,000 times through the din of battle before the silence took me. He was kneeling in the mud. His helmet was off. His hands were on either side of his head, pressed flat against his temples, and his fingers were digging into his own skull. The skin had broken. I could see blood between his fingers, dark and thick, and his face was turned upward toward the rain, and his mouth was open. And I knew with a certainty that bypassed reason and went straight to the animal core of my brain, that he was listening to something beautiful, something that was destroying him, and he did not want it to stop. I ran. I am not proud of it. I am a soldier of the Astra Militarum. I have served the God Emperor for 23 years. I have held the line on 9 worlds, and I have never broken, never fled, never turned my back on the enemy. But I ran. I ran down the communication trench, with my boots slipping on the duckboards, and my hands scraping along the walls, and the rain in my face, and the silence roaring in my head. I ran until I could not run, and then I stopped, and I braced my hands on my knees, and I breathed, and I tried to think. The command bunker, that was where I needed to go. Colonel Vescaran and his staff, the Vox operators, the tacticians, the commissar, they would know what was happening. They would have a plan. They always had a plan, even when the plan was simply to die in an orderly fashion. The command bunker was 2 kilometers south along the communication trench, through 3 junctions and past the ammunition depot and the field surgeon station. 2 kilometers, in a trench, through whatever this was. I checked my last pistol. The charge indicator showed 3/4 full. I had no spare cells. I had left them with the crate I dropped at the junction. I had my trench knife, standard issue, 20 centimeters of sharpened steel with a brass knuckle guard. I had my rebreather, my helmet, my flak vest. I had my silence. I started walking. The first 100 meters were empty. The trench curved gently to the east, and the walls were higher here, reinforced with proper rockcrete panels, and I could see nothing but mud and metal and the low gray sky above. I moved quickly but carefully, staying close to the wall, one hand on my las pistol, the other trailing along the rough surface for balance. My boots found the duckboards by feel. My eyes swept the trench ahead. The rain, intensified. I came to the first junction and found the second fire bay, and what I found there was worse. Not because the madness was more advanced, but because it was further along. The soldiers here had been affected longer, or had been closer to the source, or were simply less resistant. I do not know. I only know what I saw. They were dancing. Throne helped me. They were dancing. 8 men in full combat gear, their weapons discarded, their flak armor hanging in pieces, turning and swaying and stumbling through the mud in something that was almost a waltz and almost a seizure. Their movements were synchronized in a way that no human coordination could achieve, each body mirroring the others with a precision that spoke of puppetry, of strings being pulled by hands I could not see. They moved in a circle, round and round in the narrow confines of the fire bay, and their faces were masks of bloody rapture, and their boots made patterns in the mud that I refused to look at, because the patterns were not random, and they were not imperial. One of them saw me. His head snapped toward me with an abruptness that should have broken his neck, and his eyes, those black, dilated, inhuman eyes, locked on mine, and his mouth stretched into that terrible smile, and he reached for me. His hand came toward my face with the slow, deliberate grace of a lover's caress, and I shot him. The last bolt took him in the shoulder. In the silence, I saw the flash, saw the fabric of his uniform ignite and smolder, saw the impact twist his body sideways. He staggered. He did not fall. He looked at the wound in his shoulder, at the burned flesh and the wisps of smoke, and his smile widened, and his mouth formed a single word that I did not need to hear to understand. More. I fired again. Center mass. He went down. The others did not react. They kept dancing. I edged past them with my back pressed against the far wall, and my last pistol raised, and my finger on the trigger, and they did not look at me, and their dance did not falter. And I could feel the vibration of their footfalls through the duckboards, a rhythm, a beat, a pulse that had nothing to do with human music. Beyond the fire bay, the communication trench narrowed again. I had to crouch to move forward. The roof of corrugated iron barely a meter above the duckboard, and the mud was deeper here, knee-high in places, sucking at my boots with each step. I was breathing hard. The rebreather was fogging my vision. I pulled it down for a moment, just a moment, and tasted the air. It was cold and wet, and tasted of iron and something else. Something sweet like incense, but not incense like flowers, but not flowers. I jammed the rebreather back into place and kept moving. The ammunition depot was a widened section of the trench, roofed and walled with reinforced plating, stacked floor to ceiling with crates of power cells, last packs, mortar rounds, and Earthshaker shells in their padded cradles. Normally, a squad of Munitorum adepts would be here, logging and distributing. I found 3 of them. 2 were dead. They had killed each other, or rather, they had opened each other up with their utility knives in what appeared to be a mutual and consensual act of vivisection. They lay facing each other in the mud, their abdomens open, their hands still intertwined, their faces peaceful. The third was alive. He was sitting on a crate of mortar rounds, with his back against the wall and his hands folded in his lap. And he was staring at the ceiling with eyes that saw something I could not see. And his lips were moving in a continuous, silent litany. I did not stop. I could not stop. I stepped over the dead and past the living and kept moving. At the second junction, I found the Commissar. Commissar Dravan. I had feared him. Every soldier feared him. He was a tall man, gaunt, with a face like a hatchet, and eyes that could make a veteran guardsman feel like a child caught stealing. He wore his black greatcoat like a vestment, carried his bolt pistol like a scepter, and dispensed the Emperor's justice with the cold efficiency of a man who had never once questioned his purpose. He was standing in the junction with his bolt pistol in his hand, and his cap missing, and his greatcoat splattered with blood. At his feet lay 4 bodies. Soldiers. He had executed them. Summary field punishment for dereliction, or madness, or whatever regulation he had reached for in the final, desperate moments before the whatever it was reached him too. Because it had reached him. I could see it. His back was to me, and he was standing very straight, the way he always stood, but his head was tilted. That same tilt, that same terrible angle, as if listening to something coming from the north, something that pulled his attention the way the Astronomicon pulls a navigator's soul. His bolt pistol was at his side, the barrel still smoking faintly, and his free hand was at his throat, his fingers working at the buttons of his collar. I tried to move past him. I tried to be silent, which was easy, because I was always silent now. The deaf man who made no noise because he could not gauge the sound of his own footsteps. But the mud betrayed me. My boot hit something beneath the surface, a buried stake or a fragment of duckboard, and I stumbled, and my hand hit the trench wall, and the vibration traveled through the metal. Dravan turned. His face. Emperor. His face. The hatchet features were still there, the sharp jaw and the thin lips and the hooded eyes, but they had been rearranged somehow. Not physically, not yet, but in their expression. He was smiling. I had never seen Commissar Dravan smile. No one had. I do not think the muscles of his face had been designed for it. The smile was wrong. It pulled his skin in directions it was not meant to go. It showed too many teeth, and his eyes were black and wet and full of something that might have been love if love could kill. He raised the bolt pistol, not at me, at himself. He placed the barrel beneath his chin, and I saw his finger tighten on the trigger, and I lunged. I do not know why. Instinct, perhaps, or the desperate, irrational need to save something, anything, from whatever was consuming my regiment. I hit his arm as the bolt pistol fired, and the round went wide, blowing a chunk of rockcrete from the trench wall. The detonation, the bolt round's mass-reactive warhead. I felt it as a pressure wave, a punch of displaced air against my face. No sound, just force. Dravan staggered. I grabbed his wrist and twisted, and the bolt pistol fell into the mud, and I shoved him against the wall and held him there. He looked at me. His mouth was moving. He was speaking, or shouting, or screaming. and I could not hear any of it. And his blood-rimmed eyes searched my face with an intensity that burned. He was trying to tell me something. His lips formed shapes that I tried to read, tried desperately to understand. But he was speaking too fast, or the words were not low Gothic, or his mouth was no longer making human shapes. Then he stopped. His eyes focused on me, truly focused, and I saw a moment of clarity, a flicker of the commissar he had been. The cold, certain, terrifying man who had kept our regiment in line through 9 campaigns. His lips moved slowly, deliberately, forming words I could read. They are singing. And then, do not listen. His eyes lost focus. The clarity faded. The terrible smile returned. He slid down the trench wall, his hands going to his ears, pressing flat against the sides of his head, and he began to rock back and forth in the mud. And I left him there because there was nothing else I could do. I kept walking, one foot in front of the other. The trench was a river of mud now, waist deep in places, and I hauled myself through it by grabbing the support stakes and pulling hand over hand like a man swimming through earth. The rain was relentless. The sky was the color of a bruise, and everywhere I looked, the soldiers of the Carnathian 91st were lost. In the 3rd Fire Bay, I found men who had progressed beyond the dancing. They were on the ground, writhing, and their bodies were changing. I will describe it because the record demands it, but I want you to know that writing these words, even now, even here in whatever safety I have found, makes my hand shake and my gorge rise. Their skin was moving, not rippling as I had seen before, but flowing like liquid, reshaping itself in real time. Bones cracked and reformed beneath flesh that had become translucent, and I could see the muscles beneath, red and glistening, rearranging themselves into configurations that served no biological function I could recognize. One man's rib cage had opened like a flower, the ribs splaying outward, and from the cavity within, something was emerging. Something pink and wet and singing. I knew it was singing, even though I could not hear it, because the air around it shimmered, and the rain falling near it changed direction. I pressed my back against the trench wall and sidled past. I did not look down. I felt things brush against my boots beneath the mud, and I did not look down. I stared straight ahead and counted my steps and prayed to the God Emperor of mankind with a fervor I had never possessed before the silence, because in the silence, prayer was the only voice left to me. Beyond the 3rd Fire Bay, the trench opened into the field chirurgeon station. It was a wide dugout, roofed with canvas stretched over metal poles, lit by a single luminator that flickered and buzzed, though I could only see the flicker and had to imagine the buzz. The cots were full. The wounded from the morning shelling, men with shrapnel injuries, and last burns and the dull, glazed look of concussion, were in their beds. They were not moving, they were not breathing, They were smiling. Every single one of them. 23 wounded men, smiling in their cots with blood tear tracks on their faces, and their hands folded across their chests like corpses prepared for burial. And they were alive. I could see the pulse in their throats, but they were somewhere else. Somewhere far away, somewhere the singing had taken them. The chirurgeon was dead. She had driven a bone saw into her own temple. She had done it neatly, precisely, with the professional skill of a woman who knew exactly where to cut. There was very little blood. Her face was calm. I took a canteen from the supply rack and drank. The water tasted of metal and mud. I checked my last pistol. Half charge. I had fired twice. I had kilometers to go. I kept walking. The trench beyond the chirurgeon's station descended. The walls grew taller. The mud grew deeper. I was in the deep communication trench now, the main artery that connected the forward positions to the command bunker. And it was here that I began to see the enemy. They came from the north. They came through the forward trenches, where our men had dropped their weapons and opened their arms and welcomed them. I saw them first as shapes, tall shapes, taller than men, moving through the rain with a grace that no ceramite-armored warrior should possess. Their armor was purple and gold and pink. The colors wrong. The colors too vivid, too saturated, as if reality itself was blushing in their presence. They moved in formation, but it was not a military formation. It was a procession, a parade. They walked with the slow, deliberate steps of priests approaching an altar. And at the head of their column walked a figure in armor that screamed. I mean that literally. The armor was screaming. The surfaces of its plates were textured with faces, dozens of faces, pressed into the ceramite like death masks, and their mouths were open, and I could see the shapes of their screams even though I could hear nothing. And the air around the figure rippled and distorted, as if heat were pouring off it in waves. The figure carried a weapon I did not recognize. It was long, tubular, organic in its curves, fused to the figure's gauntlet in a way that made it unclear where the weapon ended and the arm began. Its barrel, if barrel it was, opened into a bell shape, like a Vox horn, like a mouth, a sonic weapon. I understood then, not gas, not a chemical agent. Sound. Sound is a weapon. Sound is a plague. Sound that entered through the ears and rewrote the mind and turned loyal soldiers of the Emperor into weeping, dancing, self-destructing puppets. And I, Bombardier First Class Tovar Maes, deaf as a stone, deaf as the earth, deaf as the dead, could not hear it. I was immune. The realization hit me with the force of an artillery shell. I was immune. The silence that had been my prison, my curse, the injury that had severed me from the world and from my brothers, was the only thing standing between me and the madness that had consumed my regiment. The enemy's greatest weapon could not touch me. I was invisible to it, beneath it, a stone in a river of sound, unmoved, while everything around me was swept away. I pressed myself into a shallow cut in the trench wall. a foxhole barely large enough for a man, and I watched the procession pass. They were close. Close enough that I could see the details of their armor, the Baroque engravings, the obscene filigree, the way the purple deepened to black in the crevices, and the gold caught the rain and turned it to something that was not water. They walked past me within arm's reach, and they did not see me, or they did not care, because I was nothing. A deaf man in a hole, a broken thing beneath their notice. The figure with the sonic weapon passed closest. I could feel something even through my deafness. Not sound, but pressure. A heaviness in the air, a thickening, as if the atmosphere itself was being compressed by whatever noise the weapon was producing. My skin prickled. The hair on my arms stood up. My teeth ached, and the ringing in my ears, the constant, maddening, phantom ringing, wavered. For a moment, it changed pitch, became something almost like a note, almost like a voice. And then it was gone, and the procession had passed, and I was alone in the trench, with the mud and the rain and the silence. I waited until I could no longer see them. Then I climbed out of the foxhole and continued south. The last kilometer was the worst. The trenches here were full of my comrades. Not soldiers anymore. Not men. They were things, halfway between what they had been and what the singing was making them become. They crawled through the mud on hands and knees, or lay on their backs staring upward at the rain with expressions of unspeakable bliss, or stood in clusters, facing each other, their mouths opening and closing in unison. A choir without a conductor, without a song I could hear. Their bodies were wrong. Not all of them. Not yet. But the changes were spreading. Fingers too long, joints bending backward, skin that rippled with subcutaneous movement, eyes that had changed color, going from brown and blue and gray to a uniform, luminous violet that glowed faintly in the trench's shadows. I crawled, on my belly, through the mud, under their feet, and between their legs and over their discarded weapons and their torn armor and the things that had fallen out of them that I would not name and could not forget. The mud was in my mouth, in my nose, in my eyes. I breathed through the rebreather and tasted rubber and recycled air and kept crawling. I felt hands touch me, fingers trailing across my back, my legs, my neck. Gentle touches, curious touches. The way a child might touch an insect before pulling off its wings. But they did not stop me. They touched and moved on. Or I moved on, and the touches faded, and I crawled. I passed the ammunition depot secondary, where shells were stacked to the ceiling. Someone had been painting on the walls, using blood, using mud, using substances I chose not to identify. The symbols they had painted were large and intricate, and I looked away from them immediately, because even in the briefest glance I could feel them trying to settle into my mind, trying to take root, trying to grow. I passed the reserve trench, where the second line of defense should have been. It was empty. Every soldier gone, drawn north by the singing like moths to a flame that burned with sound instead of light. And then finally, I saw the command bunker. It was a squat, ugly structure of reinforced rockcrete and adamantine, set into the earth like a rotten tooth, its armored door facing south, its Vox array bristling from its roof like the spines of some deep-sea creature. The door was closed. The firing slits were dark. There were bodies outside, sprawled in the mud, soldiers who had been stationed as guards. They were not dead. They were lying on their backs in the rain, holding hands, a circle of men with their eyes closed and their faces turned toward the sky, breathing in unison, a chain of shared madness. I stepped over them. I reached the door. I pounded on it with my fists, feeling the vibration travel up my arms and into my shoulders, not knowing if I was making any sound, not knowing if anyone inside could hear me, not knowing if anyone inside was still sane enough to respond. The door opened. A face appeared in the gap. Lieutenant Khan. Young, pale, frightened. His eyes were red-rimmed but clear. His hands were shaking, but his grip on his last pistol was firm. He saw me, and his mouth moved, and I pointed to my ears and shook my head. He stepped back. I squeezed through the gap. The door closed behind me with a vibration I felt through the floor. Inside, the command bunker was a single room, low-ceilinged, thick-walled, lit by 3 luminators running on backup power. There were 7 people alive inside. Lieutenant Khan. 2 Vox operators, both with blood running from their ears, both with their headsets torn off and thrown across the room. A Munitorum clerk clutching a data slate to his chest like a prayer book. 2 guardsmen from the headquarters platoon, crouching behind the central table with their las guns raised. And Colonel Vescaran. The colonel was standing at the far wall, studying a map that was covered in red pins and pencil marks, and circles drawn in increasingly frantic, overlapping strokes. He turned when I entered, and his face was gray, and his jaw was set, and his eyes held the look of a man who had already calculated the odds and found them to be 0, but intended to fight anyway because fighting was all he had left. He spoke to me. I saw his lips move. I pointed to my ears. He nodded. He turned to the table and picked up a sheaf of papers and a pencil, and wrote in quick, sharp strokes, and held the paper up for me to read. Enemy force. Sonic weaponry. Entire line compromised. Vox is dead. We have sent 3 runners south. None returned. We are cut off. I took the pencil and wrote beneath his words. I walked through it. I am deaf. It cannot touch me. He stared at what I had written. He looked at me. His mouth moved. He was saying something to the others. The 2 guardsmen behind the table looked at me. The Vox operators looked at me. Everyone was looking at me with an expression I could not decipher, something between hope and horror. And then the colonel was writing again. Can you reach the 78th Line Corps? South, 12 kilometers. Through the tertiary trench system. They need to know. They need to bring flamers. Lots of flamers. I read it. I looked at the door. 12 kilometers south. Through trenches full of singing madness. In the mud and the rain. Alone. I wrote 1 word. Yes. The colonel wrote more. He wrote quickly, filling a page, then another, folding them. sealing them with wax from a candle on the table, pressing his signet ring into the wax to authenticate them. He handed me the papers. His hand was steady. His eyes were not. He held my gaze for a long moment. This man I had never spoken to, this colonel whose voice I had never heard. And he placed his hand on my shoulder, and he squeezed once, firmly, and then he let go and turned back to his map. Lieutenant Khan led me to the door. He opened it a crack and peered out. He turned to me and his lips formed words I could read. "The Emperor protects." I nodded. I stepped outside. The rain had stopped. The sky was darker than before, a deep, bruised purple that seemed to pulse faintly, as if something behind the clouds was breathing. The soldiers on the ground were still lying in their circle, still holding hands, still smiling. I stepped over them and entered the tertiary trench system, and began to walk south. I will not describe every step of that journey. I cannot. The memory is a mudscape of horror, a continuous, unbroken ribbon of atrocity, witnessed in perfect silence. I will tell you only the moments that burn themselves into me so deeply that I can still see them when I close my eyes, which is always because I have not slept since Carath Primus, and I do not think I will sleep again. I will tell you about the chapel. There was a field chapel in the tertiary trench, a dugout where the Ministorum preacher had held services. It was little more than a hole in the ground, with a cloth draped over the entrance and a crude wooden aquila nailed to a post inside. The preacher, whose name was Viridius, was inside when I passed. He was on his knees before the aquila. His hands were clasped in prayer. His head was bowed, and from the outside, if you did not look closely, you would think he was praying. But the aquila was upside down, and the words his lips were forming were not the words of any imperial prayer I had ever learned. And the shadows in the dugout were moving in ways that shadows should not move, folding and unfolding, and reaching toward me like fingers, and I pulled the cloth shut and kept walking. I will tell you about the field of lost guns. 300 meters south of the chapel, the trench opened into a wide staging area, a marshalling point for reserves, and the ground was covered with lost guns. Hundreds of them, neatly arranged in rows, butts touching, barrels pointing outward, like the petals of a great metal flower. Someone, many someones, had laid down their weapons with deliberate care, arranging them in a pattern that was precise and purposeful and terrible. I walked through the field of guns and felt their power cells humming beneath my boots, and kept my eyes forward and did not look at the pattern from above because I knew in my bones that the pattern was a symbol, and the symbol was a name, and the name was not one that should be spoken or written or thought. I will tell you about the Singing Man. 6 kilometers south, in a stretch of trench that was empty and dark and deep, I found a single guardsman sitting on the duckboards with his back against the wall. He was alive. He was not changed. His eyes were brown, not violet. His face was haggard and streaked with mud and tears. But it was a human face, expressing human misery. His hands were over his ears. He was pressing so hard that his fingertips were white. I crouched in front of him. I took his wrists gently and pulled his hands away from his ears. His mouth opened in a cry that I could not hear. His eyes found mine, and they were desperate and pleading, and I could read his lips clearly. It was the same phrase, over and over. Make it stop. Make it stop. Please, make it stop. I held his hands. I looked into his eyes. I could not speak to him, because I could not hear my own voice, and did not know if I was whispering or screaming. I did the only thing I could do. I held up the colonel's sealed papers. I pointed south. I pointed to him, then to me, then south again. He understood. Or he chose to. He stood on shaking legs and put his hands back over his ears and walked beside me. And we went south together, the deaf man and the man who wished he was deaf. And we did not speak, because neither of us could. He lasted 4 more kilometers. Then he stopped. He took his hands off his ears. His face changed. That bliss, that terrible, ecstatic, agonized bliss, settled over his features like a mask, and his eyes went black, and he turned north, and he walked away from me without looking back. Drawn by the singing I could not hear, I watched him go. I watched until he disappeared around a bend in the trench. And then I was alone again, and I kept walking. I reached the 78th Line Corps' forward positions at some hour I cannot identify, because the sky had not changed, and my chronometer had stopped, and time had become meaningless. I stumbled into their trench line and fell into the arms of a startled sentry, and pushed the colonel's papers into his hands and collapsed in the mud. And I lay there shaking, and I felt the vibration of boots running on duckboards, and I felt hands lift me, and I was carried into a dugout and laid on a cot, and someone put a blanket over me, and I stared at the ceiling and did not move. They acted on the colonel's orders. I know this because they told me later, in writing, that 3 companies moved north within the hour, equipped with flamers and melter weapons, and ministorum priests chanting words of abjuration. I know that they encountered the singing 2 kilometers north and lost 40 men in the first minute. I know that they burned their way through the trenches, purging everything that moved, cleansing everything that had been touched. I know that they reached the command bunker and found it empty. The door was open, the luminators were still on, the map was still on the wall. There was no sign of Colonel Vox-Ghost or Lieutenant Khan or the others. Only the Vox set, which was active, broadcasting a single continuous tone on all frequencies that the tech adepts later classified as Hereticus Extremis and refused to describe. I know that 6 days later the order came down from the Ordo Hereticus, Firestone class Exterminatus. Kerath Primus was cleansed by orbital bombardment that burned the atmosphere itself and turned the surface to glass. The Carnathian 91st was struck from the rolls of the Astra Militarum. Our name, our history, our battle honors, all of it erased, as if we had never existed. I know this because I was on the last transport off-world, the only survivor of my regiment, lying on a stretcher in the hold, with a MEMETIC orderly writing me notes I could not bring myself to read. That should be the end of the story. The deaf man who walked through the singing and survived. The silence as salvation. The mercy of broken ears. But it is not the end. It has been 41 days since Karath Primus. I am in a transit station in the Helican subsector, waiting for reassignment, waiting for the Munitorum to decide what to do with a deaf bombardier from a regiment that no longer exists. I sleep in a bunk in a dormitory with 300 other transient soldiers, and I eat in a refectory that serves tasteless protein slurry. And I walk the corridors of this station and feel the vibrations of the machinery through the metal floors and see the mouths of men and women moving and understand nothing they say. The silence endures. The ringing endures. I have made my peace with it, or something close to peace. The resigned acceptance of a man who has lost a limb and learned to walk without it. But 3 days ago, something changed. I was lying in my bunk. It was the middle of the night. Cycle. The luminators dimmed to a faint amber. The dormitory full of sleeping bodies. I was staring at the ceiling, as I always stare at the ceiling, because sleep will not come, and the ringing fills the dark. And then, beneath the ringing, so faint that at first I thought I was imagining it, I heard something. Not heard. Not with my ears. My ears are dead. The chirurgeon confirmed it again 2 weeks ago, running every test, and the result was the same. Total, irreversible neural deafness. There is nothing left to hear with. But I heard it. A voice. No, not a voice. Voices. Many voices. Singing together the way a choir sings in a cathedral. Each voice distinct and yet woven into something larger. Something that was more than the sum of its parts. The sound, if sound it was, came from inside my skull, from behind my eyes, from the place where the ringing lived. It was there, nestled inside the silence, like a seed planted in dead earth that had somehow, impossibly, begun to grow. It was beautiful. Emperor, forgive me. It was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard. More beautiful than the old sow's bark. More beautiful than the voices of my comrades singing hymns in the trenches on Emperor's Day. More beautiful than my mother's voice, which I can no longer remember except as a warmth in my chest. It was a beauty that went beyond sound, beyond music, beyond anything the human ear was designed to receive. It was a beauty that spoke directly to the soul, that reached inside me and found every broken thing and promised to make it whole. I sat up in my bunk. My hands were shaking. The dormitory was dark and still, and the other soldiers were sleeping, and no one was looking at me, and no one could see the tears running down my face. Not blood tears. Not yet. Just tears. The salt-water tears of a man hearing music for the first time in 60 days. It lasted only a moment. Then it was gone, sinking back beneath the ringing, vanishing into the silence like a stone dropping into deep water. I sat there in the dark, shaking, weeping, and I pressed my hands against my ears as if I could hold the sound in, as if I could keep it, as if I could bring it back. It returned the next night, louder, clearer, more voices in the choir, more harmonies, more depth. It lasted longer. 3 heartbeats. 4. I could almost make out words in the singing syllables that curled and twisted at the edges of comprehension, that promised meaning if I could just listen a little harder, lean a little closer, open myself a little wider. Last night, it came again. It was stronger, strong enough that I could feel it in my chest. A vibration that was not physical, that did not come through the air or the floor or the walls, but rose from somewhere inside me. From the place where the sound of the Earthshaker had died, from the silence that had protected me, from the ringing that was, I now understood, not a ghost of hearing at all. It was a door. The ringing was a door, and it was opening. And behind it was the choir. And the choir had been singing since Karath Primus, singing since the day I walked through the trenches and felt the pressure of the sonic weapon brush against my skin. Singing since the moment something brushed against me in the mud. Something that was not a hand. Something that planted itself in my silence, like a seed in the quietest, most fertile soil it had ever found. I am writing this now because I do not know how many nights I have left before the door opens fully. I am writing this because someone must know. Someone must read this and understand that silence is not protection. It is invitation. The singing does not need your ears. It only needs your soul. And the soul has no armor, and no rebreather, and no flak vest to hide behind. The choir is singing. I can hear it now, even as I write, faint and distant and beautiful beyond all description. It is growing louder. It has been growing louder for 3 days, and it will grow louder still. And I know with the same certainty that told me Sergeant Hulsk was listening, that there will come a moment when it is all I can hear, when the silence fills with song, when the door opens and the music pours through, and I will understand at last what my regiment heard in the trenches of Karath Primus, and I will smile, and I will weep tears that are not tears, and I will be deaf no longer. End of recovered data. Audio fragment terminates. Data slate Sigma 97 returned to Ordo Hereticus Secure Archive. Vault designation unknown. Note appended by Inquisitorial Scribe. Designation expunged. The finger recovered with this data slate was subjected to genetic analysis. Results sealed. The transit station referenced in this account. Designation Helican Subsector Station Aurelia. 7. Was evacuated and quarantined 11 days after the estimated date of this recording. 83 personnel were found in the main dormitory, arranged in concentric circles, holding hands, smiling. All were alive. None responded to external stimuli. All were subsequently granted the Emperor's Peace by Ordo Hereticus Kill Team. Cause of death listed as sanctioned euthanasia. Cause of original affliction listed as unknown. This record is classified Hereticus Vermilion. Unauthorized access is punishable by servitor conversion. The Omnissiah protects. The Machine God preserves. This unit's task is complete. Initiating shutdown. Praise be to the God Emperor of mankind, who sits upon the golden throne, who is the light against the dark. The dark. The dark that sings. Error. Shutdown initiated. Cogitator Unit 477. Subclade Mnemonic. Tertiary Archive. Shutdown complete.